works on strong environmental climate policy. We hold lawmakers accountable, and we also work to elect pro-climate and pro-environment lawmakers. And really excited to see you all today. I think this issue is so important, and so excited to have this panel and some fabulous panelists who have joined us. And so, we're digging into, really this core issue of how are we helping every Vermonter transition off fossil fuels to clean energy? How are we making this an equitable transition and helping the most vulnerable in our communities and people with less means to make the transition? What exactly are we doing? This has been, a high priority of many of us, and so today I'm really excited to hear from, I'm going to do an official bio. Jason Eden, who goes by Jay. He's the founder and executive director of the Rural Renewable Energy Alliance, which is a national nonprofit organization dedicated to fighting energy poverty with solar power. They've served nearly 1,000 low-income families with solar energy and working to integrate low-income community solar into the federal energy assistance service delivery model. So we'll be able to hear about this really interesting model that Jason's working on. He's based in Minnesota, and we're so grateful he came out here to talk about that work. We then are also excited to have Steve Geller here with us today. And he is the executive director of the Southeastern Vermont Community Action. And this is an anti-poverty agency serving Windham and Windsor counties here in Vermont. He's also the president of the Vermont Community Action Partnership and the State Association of Community Action Agencies. And they operate a low-income weatherization program and other energy efficiency initiatives. And we'll be able to hear from Steve today on a specific example of a really successful project and the kinds of projects that we can learn from, emulate, and expand upon. So, overall, that's what we want to talk about. We'll have lots of time for Q&A, so we can facilitate that at the end. So we'll hear from both of our panelists and then do Q&A at the end. And just want to kick it over to them, but really, just again emphasizing how important this conversation is to us really getting it right and in making this transition to clean, affordable energy for all Vermonters. So excited you all chose to join us in this panel. And so, Jay, are you up first?
Yes, ma'am.
Fabulous.
Yeah.
All right, so we'll kick it right over to Jay.
Cool. All right, I'll get the light.
Thanks.
Thank you so much. Well, good afternoon, everyone. Really appreciate y'all joining us for this discussion about making solar accessible to low-income communities. If we actually want to make a transition to a renewable economy, a clean energy economy, it's absolutely essential that we intentionally create pathways to ensure that our low-income neighbors, friends, community members can also participate in the benefits of the clean energy economy, of solar energy in particular. So our organization is based in Minnesota. However, we have the opportunity to work with community action agencies like Steve's all across the country to formally integrate solar into the Federal Energy Assistance Program. Now, some of you might be aware of what that program is. Some of you might not be. So I want to start just by briefly telling you a little bit about a challenge that's experienced by many Americans. So this time of year, families all across Vermont, families all across the country have to make some very difficult choices. Now, some of you might be thinking difficult choices like, am I going to ski at Stowe, or am I going to ski at Sugar Bush or Smuggler's Notch? Those are not actually the choices that I'm referring to. The choices, the challenging choices, the difficult choices that I'm referring to are paying the heating bill or paying the health care bill, paying the home energy bill or paying the house payment. And in the most extreme cases, I'm talking about choosing between heating or eating. So energy poverty is experienced by about 15% of Americans, by about 15% of Vermonters.
It's 40.
So when families...
40 in Vermont, 40%.
40% in Vermont. Nationally, it's about 1 in 8. So when families have to choose between home energy and other basic needs, families are living in what we typically call energy poverty. Now, just to put a quick human face to energy poverty, many of our neighbors are actually having to make these choices. So I want everyone just to briefly imagine a loved one having to choose between home energy or healthcare. This is actually a very common problem. And in fact, it can be a very severe situation for many Americans. Now, although this is not a Vermont example, there are actually people each and every year who freeze to death from energy poverty. Although energy poverty is a situation across the country, it is endemic in some communities. And in many First Nations across the United States, energy poverty is the norm rather than the exception. And I'm sure many of you are, of course, familiar with Standing Rock. In Standing Rock, despite the fact that billions of dollars of commodities are flowing beneath that community, there are people each and every year who freeze to death from energy poverty. Energy poverty, however, is barely on the societal radar. Very few people are aware of the fact that our Americans are having to face these choices. Now, one of the interesting aspects of dependence on fossil fuels is that it has a disproportionate impact on our lower income communities. The less money we make, the greater percentage of our income that we have to dedicate to what's arguably the basic need of heat and power. So if you're living below the poverty level, it's possible for you to spend somewhere between 20 and 30% of your entire income on home energy. Now, upper and moderate income families typically spend somewhere between 2, 3, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9% of their total income on energy poverty. But again, if you're living beneath the poverty level, you can spend up to a quarter of your total annual income on heat and power. So again, fossil fuel dependency has a disproportionate impact on our lower income communities. Now, fortunately for families that are struggling with energy poverty, there is a national safety net, an essential safety net. And if you haven't lived in energy poverty, or if you haven't served families that are living in energy poverty, you might not be familiar with this program. Earlier today, we had a session specifically about energy burdens and about the Energy Assistance Program, which I was very happy to see. Energy assistance is a national safety net. And it's literally delivered from Key West, Florida, to Fairbanks, Alaska, San Diego, to Portland, Maine. In 96% of the counties in the United States, low-income families can turn to the Energy Assistance Program to help mitigate their energy poverty. How does that work? Just out of curiosity, how many of you are familiar with energy assistance? Oh, this is fantastic. How many of you, and I'm raising my hand, have received energy assistance? 2 of us. Okay, that's interesting. So energy assistance works in the following way. When my family was low income, we applied to the Energy Assistance Program because we simply didn't have enough resources to fill our propane tank. And as you heard earlier from Lauren, I live in northern Minnesota, and not unlike Vermont, that can be a very dire situation during the heating season. So low-income families turn to the Energy Assistance Program. They apply to receive bill assistance. And if a family is income eligible, the Energy Assistance Program, through a community action agency, will pay a portion of a low-income family's energy bills, be they electric, heat, propane, oil, whatever the case might be. So families apply to energy assistance. The local service provider selects the family based on income eligibility. And then the community action agency, the service provider, works with the fuel provider or the utility to ensure that a portion of that family's energy bills are paid for. Every single year across the country, we spend about $3.5 billion paying low-income families' energy bills. Or I should say, a portion of low-income families' energy bills. So in Minnesota alone, it's about $100 million each and every year. In Vermont, it's about $20 million each and every year. But that investment that we're making nationally only serves about a quarter of the total eligible population, a quarter of the total low-income population. So although this service is essential, although this service is critical to ensure the well-being of our low-income neighbors, we are basically hemorrhaging public resources without permanently empowering families, without creating a long-term solution, and without addressing the carbon and the climate impacts of this program. So $3.5 billion each and every year to serve a portion of the low-income population. This massive investment, albeit critical and one that needs to be preserved, that $3.5 billion investment goes directly to our friends in the utility sector. And again, this is on behalf of our low-income communities, and that's an investment that we should be making. But it really does beg a handful of questions. Is energy assistance actually providing a long-term solution? Is energy assistance actually addressing the root causes of low-income energy poverty? And more importantly, is there a better way to deliver the same service? Is there a way in which we can deliver energy assistance in a fiscally responsible and environmentally appropriate way? Can we address energy poverty in a different way? And obviously, we believe that that's possible. We believe that we can integrate solar energy into the Federal Energy Assistance Program and create a long-term solution, a low-carbon solution, a climate-appropriate solution, and quite frankly, a fiscally responsible solution. Although our work is very much motivated by social service, by environmental justice, by social justice, we have come to appreciate, if not embrace, the fact that it's also a very fiscally responsible way to deliver energy assistance. Although energy assistance has a vast number of social benefits, what is the return on investment? It's necessary. It's a service that we must provide. But there's an argument to be made that it actually has no return on investment. If, however, we incorporate solar energy into the Federal Energy Assistance Program, there is a concrete return on investment to the folks that are footing the bill for energy assistance. Who's footing the bill for energy assistance?
Taxpayers.
That's right, all of us. And so if we want to get to the root causes of energy poverty, we believe that the future of energy assistance is solar energy. Rather than just paying a low-income family's energy bills year after year, we can empower low-income families, literally, with either residential solar, rooftop solar, or with community solar subscriptions. And those subscriptions, or those shares to a community solar array, can be the vehicle for the bill assistance. So rather than simply paying their bills through the utility, we give that family a subscription to a community solar array and permanently empower that family. So if there's one thing that I hope we can all take away with us today, it's that solar energy is not only a tool to address our climate needs, not only a tool to ensure water quality and air quality, but it's also a very important tool in the fight against poverty. Who actually benefits the most from the cost-stabilizing qualities of solar energy? Well, if you recall earlier, the less money you make, the greater percentage of that income has to be devoted to heat and power. So low-income families actually can arguably benefit more from a financial perspective from the benefits of solar energy. So we are advocating for the national integration of community solar into the Federal Energy Assistance Program. So community solar for community action. Who knows what a community action agency is? Okay, a handful of us. Of course, Steve does as the executive director of the Southeast Vermont Community Action Agency. But since I only saw a couple hands, I want to briefly introduce the Community Action Agency. The Community Action Agencies are on the front lines of the fight against poverty, the war against poverty. So during the LBJ administration in 1965, a bill passed Congress that essentially launched the war on poverty. And ever since then, the community action agencies of our country have been delivering energy assistance, weatherization assistance, and a wide variety of other services that ensure the well-being of our low-income communities. Weatherization assistance in and of itself is helping reduce our carbon footprint, and community action agencies like Steve's have been doing this work literally for more than 5 decades now. So they're the unsung heroes of energy efficiency. Get to know your local community action agency because they're providing a critical service to your neighbors. This network, as I mentioned earlier, is all across the country. So by integrating solar into the community action agency service delivery model, we can rapidly scale low-income solar through an existing network. Remember, 96% of the counties in the United States have energy assistance, and that service is delivered by the community action agency locally. 1,000 agencies. Now in 2000, when we started to deliver solar to low-income families in partnership with community action agencies, we were a lone wolf. There were essentially no organizations that were talking about making solar accessible to low-income communities. Today, it's grown to a national chorus, and coast to coast, organizations like community action agencies and a wide variety of folks in the solar community are starting to very intentionally create models to deliver solar to low-income communities. We're arguing that if we want to rapidly scale low-income solar and make solar accessible to low-income communities, we should do so in partnership with the agencies that have been working with low-income communities for 50 years now. Organizations like SEVCA, community action agencies, are identifying families, they're verifying need, they're establishing relationships with families. Community action agencies can continue to do that work and then integrate solar into the program. So I want to talk a little bit about kind of the nuts and bolts of how we believe this model works. We've had the pleasure of partnering with SEVCA here in Vermont, and Steve's going to speak to the specific project that's underway right now. But if a community action agency owns 200 kilowatts, 150 kilowatts, whatever the case might be, they can use that capacity to begin to deliver the benefits of those community solar subscriptions to their low-income clients. So because it's a national network, there's a great deal of efficiency and effectiveness that we can leverage since the community action agencies are already identifying low-income families. So if a community action agency owns a community solar array, as it receives applications from low-income community members, it can right-size the community solar subscription to that family's energy burden. We can do this with all 1,000 community action agencies across the United States. So if, for example, I'm in the service territory of a community action agency as a low-income family, and my neighbor Kevin is also a low-income family in the same service territory, this year he and I apply, we're both income eligible, we receive our bill assistance, not as a one-time payment, but through a subscription to that community solar array. But next year, Kevin moves out of the community, and I get a different job, and I'm no longer income eligible. What do we do with those subscriptions? Well, the community action agency is going to receive another batch of applications for energy assistance the following year. So they're annually transferable subscriptions that directly provide bill assistance. So now Kevin's no longer in the community, and David he's moved in, he's low income, and so that subscription is transferred to David and right-sized for his family's energy burden. So in other words, it works seamlessly with the intake process of community action agencies. So essentially, we're arguing that a stopgap is not a solution. Energy assistance is essential. Let's use community solar and solar more generally within this service delivery model. So this is as much of an environmental solution as it is a social service delivery innovation. Whether you're providing affordable housing in Los Angeles or weatherizing mobile homes in Maine, LIHEAP, or the Low-Income Home Energy Assistance Program, is the common denominator. Every single low-income household in the United States can be served by this program. Right now, there's a new and emerging conversation about low-income solar, and a lot of solar developers are salivating and wringing their hands at what they perceive to be a new and emerging market. Now, that's not a bad thing, but we have to ensure that there's a service delivery component, there's a service motivation. So we're arguing that solar is a way to address low-income energy poverty and increase the amount of solar that's deployed across the country. So I'm about to pass the baton here to Steve, but I just want to say a couple few more comments. As important as energy assistance is, it's not providing a solution. And we want our national social service models to actually be permanently empowering families. There is literally no return on investment to energy assistance. But I'm not being disparaging about the program. My family received energy assistance for many, many years. It was an essential service for us in order for us to get back on our feet. It is essential. We need to defend it. However, we also need to begin to create a carve-out within this $3.7 billion annual investment that is dedicated to slowly deploying or rapidly deploying solar within this same program sector. So this all boils down to, do we want a carbon-intensive energy assistance program? The International Monetary Fund and the World Bank have both identified the energy assistance program as yet another fossil fuel subsidy. So the question is, do we want energy assistance or do we want solar assistance? Now, in the communities that we serve, we go to great lengths to hire people from that community so that we can foster an inclusive solar workforce. Many people in the solar energy industry, frankly, look a lot like me. Pale, stale, and male. It's very important that we foster an inclusive clean energy workforce so that we can all benefit from the many benefits of the solar energy industry. We have had the pleasure of working extensively with many First Nations throughout the country, and we have hired many folks from those communities to then pay it forward and work in other communities and deliver low-income community solar applications. So this is a low-income community solar array in northern Minnesota. That's very much like the project that Steve will be about to tell you about. All of these arrays are delivering additional benefit to the low-income families. The final comment is this is not just for the families. This is also for the agencies that deliver this service. Energy assistance is a congressional appropriation. Each and every year, Congress has to approve the block grants for energy assistance, which means that the energy assistance service providers don't actually know how much they're going to receive until well into the heating season or the cooling season. Because of that, organizations like Steve's, Sevka, don't necessarily know how many families they can serve. There's uncertainty. We also don't know how big energy assistance is going to be next year. Can we say with certainty that energy assistance will be solvent in 5 years? Do we know what the cost of energy is going to be in 5 years, 10 years? This is a hedge against uncertainty for the program and for the cost of energy. And by delivering solar in partnership with community action agencies, we can ensure that there's local control, local resilience, and the capacity to at least serve a percentage of low-income families within that service territory. So this is about empowering families. This is about empowering the agencies that do so. And of course, this is an environmentally responsible solution to energy assistance and energy poverty. Now the next question, of course, is how do we pay for this? Well, historically, our organization has depended on philanthropic dollars, contributed income, in order to vet this model and prove its effectiveness. We've done that, but we would be the first to acknowledge that's not a sustainable funding model. It's not a sustainable finance model. So I just want to very briefly touch on an emerging finance instrument that can not only be used in low-income solar, but many social service delivery models. It's called Pay for Success funding. And it's essentially intended to de-risk innovation in the public sector and bring new models of service delivery to the public sector at no expense to the public sector. So again, this is a market-based instrument. It's intended to de-risk innovation. And we see this as a bridge to ultimately using off-the-shelf energy assistance dollars. So ultimately, we are convinced that a portion of the LIHEAP block grants across the country will be used to deploy solar in partnership with community action agencies to permanently address energy poverty. So I just want to plant a seed about this very exciting Pay for Success financing, because we see this as a way to ultimately unlock energy assistance dollars to do more projects like Steve is doing in his community. And finally, we're all very committed to achieving 90 by 50, various renewable portfolio standards across the country. We're all very committed to making this transition to a clean energy economy. We cannot do so unless we ensure low-income communities have equal access to the benefits of solar energy and equal opportunities to participate in the clean energy economy. So this is one way in which we can ensure that low-income families and low-income communities have the opportunity to do so, is by integrating solar into energy assistance. So with that, I'm going to pass the talking stick to Steve, and his organization and ours is currently deploying the first 100% low-income community solar array in the state of Vermont.
Did we want to take a minute? Is there any clarifying questions for Jay in terms of, based on his presentation? I might get to some of that in terms of how it looks on the ground with a specific project, and some of the, I'll be dealing more with the specific decision-making that we're doing regarding who we get to be subscribers, who we do outreach to, what the benefits are going to be, what the pros and cons of different program models and target population models might be. But if there's anything about the broader context for the national model that REAL has created, we could take a couple of minutes and look at that first. Anybody?
Just a quick question. Oftentimes when people find, they spend a lot of money on, say, an inefficient car, or a pickup truck, or whatever, and then they ultimately get an efficient car that, even though they have a new efficient car, their expenses remain the same because now they're driving more than they did. Isn't it the same true with, like, say, now they have solar electricity, and so rather than pare down their energy usage, they increase it to the point where they can't afford it again? I'm just curious.
Do you have any thoughts on that, Jay?
I definitely think that's the reality, but our vision for how the community solar subscriptions are used is that they'll be right-sized for the energy burden. So energy assistance, bill assistance, is based on a fairly complex calculus, and it's based on the number of elders in the household, the number of children, their energy burden, and a couple other factors. And so we think that the community solar subscriptions will do the same, and therefore it's hard to say how that'll affect their load and whether they'll use more or not. I mean, if in fact that's taking place, that's already a weakness of the energy assistance program. But I certainly wouldn't dispute what you just said.
Your response to that?
Yeah, actually, I'll just add to that. I know that SEPCA's low-income weatherization program, one of the first things they do is they go out to people's homes and they try to educate them on how to use their home energy efficiency, and talk about
The energy efficiency coach is what
it's called an energy efficiency coach, right? Talk about what they can do and the implications of how to use their new house, if you will, after some weatherizing. So I think that should be part of this model to talk about. In reality, I think energy consumption is going up by design, but it's, with any energy efficiency, it starts with education and conserve first, reduce, so whatever it is.
And I think I would also respond to that by, in terms of our experience in the work that we do in community action, that the population that we're serving, for the most part, don't have a lot of discretionary resources, income. And our experience is that if we do give them assistance and help them with a month's rent or the fuel for a delivery of oil or whatever it is they need, they don't tend to go out and get a bigger house or get a better apartment or open the window so they can, or turn the thermostat up so they can make it warmer. What they do is they take that money and they buy the food they need. They get the clothing for their children that they've been putting off because they couldn't afford it because they had to pay their eating bills and so on. So it does, I mean, it adds to the need. They're not, for the most part, in many cases, at the level that they're dealing with. They're not banking that money, although we try to work with them. We have programs that help them to save money. But initially, at least, they'll be being able to meet more of their very basic needs by freeing up some of the money that's been used for energy use up to that point.
And isn't it some of the increase in energy usage maybe to get them up to a livable status?
It may be, especially if you, the experiences, particularly with elderly, people that we serve, that they turn their thermostats so far down that they risk hypothermia in many cases, and their health is compromised. And so maybe they can click their thermostat up a degree or two so that they at least don't have that risk for themselves, or if there's small children who are aren't developing properly if it's too cold in their homes. Anything else to clarify? Yeah.
A financial question. My initial understanding was that these community assistance or federal assistance dollars would be spent so that people could pay the solar company for the energy they're using. But it seems too that you're actually funding somehow new projects. Is that true?
Yep.
And how do you do that?
We have not yet used off-the-shelf energy assistance dollars. We hope to eventually. But we hope that the community action agencies will be the owner-operators of the community solar
That's the
arrays.
model we're working to create, not existing utility-run
Right.
programs that are giving a small discount, but basically continuing to have the flow of money come to them.
But if the money has been used to pay people's bills, now you need a big bunch of money, don't you, to build the infrastructure?
This is true.
Yes.
How do
This
you
is
do
true.
that?
So energy assistance, that $3.7 billion actually has several subsets within it. And several of those subsets are intended by their authorizing legislation to reduce long-term dependency on energy assistance. So we can quickly get into the weeds here, but two of them are Assurance 16 and the weatherization pass-through. And both of those subsets could potentially be used for the capital investment.
Yep.
Rather, we don't want to rob Peter to pay Paul and take dollars from bill assistance, because those dollars are intended for families that are in crisis and needing energy assistance tomorrow. So rather than touching those dollars, we're advocating for the use of some of these subsets, namely Assurance 16 and a carve-out within the weatherization pass-through.
What proportion of the whole is that you know of in?
So states can use up to 15% of the LIHEAP block grant without gubernatorial permission. Most states do 5 or 10%, and Assurance 16 is 5% for every
Of the
state.
total grant. I'm going to touch a little bit on our discussion with the state fuel assistance office that we had when we approached them about seeing if they would be able to contribute toward the initial capital costs. And I'll talk about that when I get into my presentation about what their response was and what we think the strategy needs to be from this point on for that. If there's no other question about, okay, let me start into what I'm going to talk about, and then certainly we'll answer any of the questions that come up regarding any of what we touched on. As Jay mentioned, I'm Steve Geller, Southeastern Vermont Community Action, or SEVCA. We're located in Westminster. Our headquarters is in Westminster, Vermont. We serve Windham and Windsor counties. The project that we're involved in with RREAL is called Community Solar for Community Action. And we hope, in partnership with RREAL, to make it a national model. RREAL has created this, what would you call that, a graphic display of sort of the overall concept in terms of the funder and developer partnership, the array built by some folks here from the company that is doing the construction, Catamount Solar, a Vermont company, a local company, the Community Action Agency, SEVCA in this case, and this is something that was very important from the very beginning of the project when we started talking with Jay and others in his organization, that they did not want this to be something that we just kind of had a small hand in, but that the utility would own and manage. The whole concept is that the community action agencies, the organizations that serve this population, would be central and instrumental in its installation and implementation and ownership over the many years that it'll be operational. And of course, the low-income Vermonters who will get the benefit in terms of reduction in their overall energy burden. And one of the things that you'll see mapped out in some of the slides is the challenge we have of determining, we haven't yet done this, and I appreciate Lauren's characterization of this as a very successful program. We don't know if it's going to be successful yet. It's still in the works, and you'll see where we are with it. But our vision is certainly that we'll be able to serve people once we get it built, and the costs are primarily all paid for. We have conservatively 25 years of electricity generated by these solar panels that, there's some annual maintenance costs, but very little in addition to what we're putting out now. So the overall cost per unit of service is really very low, and the vast majority of the benefit goes to the people that we're creating it for. This is a little, just to give you a sense of what it's going to look like. We have some ground-mounted panels at the edge of our property, at the edge of our parking lot. That's what's now been completed. You'll see some slides of that. It also calls for as much of the roof surface of our building as we can. So these are all the vaguely south-facing exposure that will give us enough electricity generated to warrant the panels we're putting on those parts of the roof. It was set up, initially we projected doing a total capacity of 150 kilowatts. The proposals we got when we put out a request for bid, several of them pointed out that in order to do that, because of the limited amount of roof space we had, we would have to put more on the ground. And that by doing that, we would trigger, I don't remember exactly what the state regulation is, but by going over more than, I think it's 15 kilowatt hours on the ground-mounted array, we would be in a different level of taxation and fees and regulations required. Also, we then come under a number of different setback regulations that, because we're on the edge of our property, you see there's another company, Vermont Casket is in that building over there, and we have to go through all kinds of zoning and other kinds of permit-seeking processes in order to have built the array as close to our property line if it was any larger than that. So, and in addition, in order to make sure that we had enough funding to do this, because the funding has been a challenge, and I'll talk to you a little bit more about that, but we thought a somewhat downsized plan for what turns out to be about 110 kilowatt at this time made more sense for the project, and that's what we decided to do. Starts out very simply. Once they got this everything done and they got the certificate of public good and all the permits they needed, the frame went up, and this whole thing was up from the very beginning within 3 days. It was an amazing process. The frame gets all tied together, then the panels start going on, one by one, and finally we have the whole ground-mounted array. That's all been done. It's been commissioned. It's churning out electricity, although I think we had this November they had the least amount of sun on record of any year in history. So, you can't win them all, but hopefully it'll get better from here. But but we're getting electricity generated right now. It's all going to SEVCA because we haven't yet determined who all the subscribers are going to be. And one of the glitches, one of the challenges that we have to face is the rules that Green Mountain Power has about projects like this, which is that we're restricted to to any changes in the, who gets the credits to 4 per year. I couldn't believe, we didn't think we understood it correctly, and we clarified it. Only 4 times a year can we make a change. So if we have someone who signs up and then moves away and is no longer eligible, they're not in the Green Mountain Power area, and we have to add somebody else, that's one individual. If we have, no matter how many people we have. So we have to plan this in a way which coordinates and minimizes the number of changes we need to do throughout the year. Just one more challenge to figure out how to make this work. This was our dedication of the ground-mounted array. We have some luminaries there. We have a few state senators, Sheila Reed from Bernie Sanders' office. This fellow here, some of you might know, David Dean, who's retired from the legislature this year, and who was previously the director of SEVCA back in the 70s and 80s, and under whose leadership we created something that is still somewhat legendary in Vermont called the SEVCA stove, which was made from old propane tanks, and which people still call me, how many years later is that, 40, 45 years, almost 40 years later, saying, do you still make those SEVCA stoves? I had one and I burnt it through, or I wanted, it was such a great stove, but we ran into the era of catalytic converters needed on wood stoves, and it just, we couldn't do it anymore. It was a very positive and joyful celebration, acknowledging the opening of that part of the project. A whole bunch of people involved, some people from Catamount doing a lot of our weatherization staff who do a lot of the energy efficiency work in our agency, and lots of other people who are part of that celebration. I should point out also, one of our major funders for the project was the Wyndham Regional Commission, and Marion Major was the representative of the WRC, who helped us with the grant that we got. It's our biggest single source of funding. We also were pleased to dedicate the array to our previous weatherization director, who sadly died this year after being a great leader in our agency and around the state for the work he did in the weatherization program, helping it to grow at our agency and all around the state, Harold Schmidtke, and we dedicated it to him. Okay, so here's what we've done so far. We got the Certificate of Public Good. It was received and the project commissioned by the Department of Public Service. This is what we're calling a phase 1. The ground-mounted array has been completed, commissioned, dedicated, and now is generating electricity. Not a whole lot as yet because the sun hasn't been shining all that much, but it'll come out. The fundraising has been an interesting challenge. It's been painstakingly slow, but steady. The downsized version, initially it was going to cost close to about $375,000, $380,000. We cut it down with the reduced size to about a little less than $300,000, still estimated, including the major grant from the Regional Planning Commission, several large private donations, and in the process of going after the funding, we did talk with the folks from the Office of Fuel Assistance in Vermont under the Department of Children and Families. They were and continue to be very interested in it. And they came up with a concept behind it that we thought was really, really innovative, which is that although, except for those set-asides, those carve-outs that Jay mentioned, you can't use the fuel assistance grant for, the LIHEAP grant for construction. However, they were going to basically say, we're not contributing to construction. What we're going to do is reserve credits for 25 years, which is the presumed life of the array, for a certain number of clients of the LIHEAP program, of the state fuel assistance program, based on the number of people, and for them, if they had been able to contribute to it, which they turned out they weren't in this case, they would have restricted the program to those who heat with electricity, because that's one of the categories that they do serve. Because the LIHEAP grant requires that the primary heat source be identified. So even though they might need electricity, if they didn't heat with it, they wouldn't have been eligible to designate electricity as the target of their LIHEAP funding. Great idea. So we were able to actually quantify the amount that would be for a certain number of clients based on what we thought that size of an array would produce over the course of the year. Made that presentation to the federal office, and the Fed said, interesting, and they thought about it, and they had a couple of different discussions, and they said, yeah, no, I don't think we're gonna be able to do that. Now, they didn't say this is impossible on the face of it. I think it was just more, they didn't wanna sort of ruffle any feathers, they didn't wanna try something untested. But we were left feeling like this could still be a possibility in terms of the way they were thinking about it. And so it's still the idea of LIHEAP funding basically paying for credits, long-term, multi-year credits for clients, which they would then be eligible for every year, either that family or substituting families who were, comparably eligible, would be one way of getting federal funds to contribute toward the ongoing sustainability of projects like this. Stay tuned, we're still gonna go back and try that some more. As I said, the project was downsized due to a number of things, the permitting, the setback requirements, fundraising capacity, and the changes in Vermont's net metering rate structure, which sort of hit in the middle of between when we first started the project and when we went to get all of the approvals for it. Turns out that nothing's ever easy. So although the ground mounted work was fine, the ground will hold it, our roof needed some shoring up, as it turns out. And so we had to, because you had to have a structural engineer come in and look at the roof structure, and they came back with a assessment that said we've got some broken trusses, we need some to shore up and double up some of the members and the trusses and some more diagonals, a number of other kind of things. So we're still in the process of trying to put out an RFP for that work and to contractors to see what it'll cost and when we might be able to do that. Doesn't in no way means that we're not going to be able to do the roof. We just had to. That's what led us to break it up into phase 1 on the ground and phase 2 on the roof. Initially, we were just going to sort of sweep through and do it all at once. But one of the things we really didn't anticipate, we had no indication before the engineer went up into, up through the hatch and looked at the trusses that there was any reason for concern. It had lasted for 40-something years, as far as we knew. So we're dealing with that. And then the primary thing we've really started to dig our teeth into is the challenge of the program design. This is sort of one of those, somebody used an analogy before of the dog chasing the car. We got this wonderful project, and we've run after it, we've got it, and it's going forward, and now we have to figure out exactly how to do it, and who gets served, and what the level of benefits are, and be able to, there's a finite amount of electricity that'll be generated. We have to figure out how to allocate that in the most effective way possible. So we're looking at a number of different things. First of all, who's the target population? We want to, the question is, or the dichotomy is between the highest potential impact on specific households versus the simplicity and ease of participating. So although we might want to try to zero in on finding the people who are most vulnerable with the highest energy cost burden, we also don't want to make the process so painful and so administratively heavy that people find it difficult to apply and get the services. Eligibility determination, we need to look at sort of how stringent and how detail-laden that is between accuracy and relevance versus documentation, difficulty, cost, and administrative burden. Those are some of the parameters we're trying to figure out now. The level of assistance. this is something we always look at in terms of, and the state does, in terms of what its average benefit is with LIHEAP, and we're looking at the same thing for us. We want a meaningful individual level of benefit versus a meaningful number of people served. So we could give, you know, a very few people a great large level of assistance, but that wouldn't go very far in terms of the impact on the community. Or we could give them less but serve a lot more. And we need to figure out where that sweet spot is. The state does this every year. We work with them typically to kind of get a handle on, based on the funding and how many people we think are gonna be eligible, what that number is. And that, so this is, we look at this as an opportunity that we now have discretion about how we define all of these parameters. But it's also a challenge that we're facing now. Before, with most of the funding we have for this kind of service, the state says, here's the way you do it, here's the guidelines, here's the rules. You figure out, you know, how to carry those out, but we don't have a lot of discretion to say, well, we're gonna give you more than is allowed by the state's rules, or more assist than the state allows. So this is a open-ended, pretty much, opportunity, but it does come with its challenges to figure out how to do it best. We want to figure out how to integrate best with weatherization and the energy efficiency coaching, as Phil in the back pointed out before, so that we're getting the biggest bang for the buck when people get their, you know, their benefits. Make sure that we're not wasting, and they're not wasting the energy that they're getting. And there's an issue about housing stability. Because of the rules that GMP has, and because we want the program to have a meaningful impact beyond a month or two, we want to bring in we need to bring in some factor that relates to people's, the expectation we have for how long people are going to be in a particular residence. And because the last thing we can't, what happens, I started to say before, what happens if we get more than 4 changes a year, that the next change goes back to GMP. The credits go back to GMP. They then absorb, we can't then add anybody after the 4th change. It's a terrible dilemma to have. So we need to be very careful about that to make sure that every you know, kilowatt hour of electricity that's being generated by this array is going to the people that it's designed to benefit, and not going back to the utility. So just quickly, a summary of, you know, each of these kinds of issues around participant criteria. We would like to, I think, ideally target the people with the highest energy cost burden. It's the most directly relevant measure, and it gives us the maximum flexibility in the criteria for eligibility. On the other hand, how do we define that? There are a lot of different ways that that's been defined, and we need to look at the literature, look at the experience, and see what makes sense. What documentation will we require in order to make someone eligible if we're looking at a complex kind of measure like energy cost burden, and how will we get that documentation? And the question is it too complicated and expensive to implement? We could, as the state had suggested, we could target it to people who heat with electricity, which typically makes their electric bills hugely soar through the roof. That's a finite and easily identifiable group. The data and documentation is readily available through the electric company, so the determination of eligibility should be simple. On the other hand, it creates a very limited, it narrows the population down to a very limited group. It doesn't address the overall energy burden, only accounting for the one energy source. And it leaves out the use of space heaters that many people are forced to use to supplement their primary heat source. Because if it's not named as the primary heat source, it really won't get counted. We might want to target it to households who are ineligible for the state fuel assistance or other sources of assistance. The benefits of that is that it sort of spreads the benefit to a group that is maybe frequently unserved or underserved. It allocates benefits more fairly and evenly and increases the flexibility in who can receive assistance of this kind. The challenge is, how do we know that these households are more in need than those who qualify for or receive other assistance, that they still may have a lower total energy cost burden, and we want to make sure that this is having the greatest impact on the people we want it to help. And it will require an additional eligibility determination, because we'll have to see what their eligibility is, or lack of eligibility for whatever other, the state LIHEAP program. We could dedicate it to people who received or will be receiving weatherization, and therefore get the energy coaching that comes as part of that, which tends to minimize the inefficient use of this scarce resource and creates better informed energy consumers, which we also want to make sure we're doing. On the other hand, it means that fewer households will be receiving a larger bundle of benefits, so that they're already getting weatherization, they're getting this as well, and some people may not be getting either of those things. And it would benefit a lower percentage of renters in this case, although the renters tend to have a higher energy cost burden statistically, historically, on the whole. And as I said, we want to make sure whatever we're doing, we're having people with an expectation, we're serving people with the expectation of some level of housing stability, hopefully for at least a year, because of the issues around the changing, the limits of change that GMP has. And it also enables us to have a greater impact on those households rather than an episodic, a month here, a month in some other situation. And it could be viewed as discriminatory if we're, cutting off people who we may not know what they're, we may be basing it on their housing history, and we may be, inadvertently or not without any intention, creating some level of discrimination against that group of households. So those are the things we're thinking about now. We're trying to zero in on what the criteria would look like, what the population of subscribers would look like, and as soon as we can, put it out there and start getting those people signed up so that we can get that electricity out to them. Now, we only have a small portion still of what we're going to have to give them, because we only have the phase one, the ground-mounted array up as yet. But still, we want to try to get that going and serve as many people as we can, as quickly as we can. So that's where we are now at SEPCA, and we're working hard to try to come to some conclusions about that. Any questions or comments or suggestions about how you think we should be targeting the service? Yeah.
I wonder about is SEPCA allowed to be an off-taker? And if you're
A what?
An off-taker of the array, and if you're banking those credits, are you allowed to gift the credits? My organization has been a recipient of gifted credits.
So you mean if we identify SEPCA as one of the recipients, we are giving a small percentage to SEPCA. I think, if I recall, our initial projection was about 15% of the total that comes off the array. And that really is just to offset our ongoing maintenance costs, going forward. But at least 85% of it is going to go to the recipients.
But I wonder if you could have SEPCA as a permanent off-taker and then gifting the banked credits to,
gifting them from there.
to whoever needs them without having to make those form
Right.
changes.
I
Maybe
don't
a way
think
to
so.
use that.
I think that represents a change, because every time we gift them,
It would
I
still
think
be
that represents a change, because they have to
process.
change that account that's receiving them. And that's my understanding, that it amounts to the same thing. Phil, do you know anything about that?
I don't know anything about that, I just know
Why
the
not?
suggestion. But, is it possible to have a large user buy all the credits just and from SEPCA, so you can monetize them that way? That would create a cash pool that you could then use to.
And then use the
use
dollars
that
to
credit
actually support it?
discretionary pool.
I don't know that we've thought about that.
So you'd be paying their electric bill, right?
So that we'd be paying the bill, essentially,
Or they'd just be buying all the credits off your array.
I don't know that that's come up as an option, but I will certainly
That would
put out
modify
some
it.
feelers about that. Offhand, I'd say they would look at that as trying to skirt around the requirements, but.
It is.
It is, but, yeah, maybe too blatantly, I don't know. We had a question here and then over there.
Yeah, I mean, I know that, housing trusts use tax credit investors in funding affordable housing. Did you look at, tax equity investors?
We did look at that. Jason, I think could speak to that.
Yeah, we have some reservations about using tax equity in the capital stack for this project because there's a substantial amount of capital flight from the community in that model. Because if we're using a PPA as an instrument to deliver benefit to the families, then there's a very modest amount of benefit. And what we're trying to model is using the subscriptions themselves as the bill assistance. And so if we use tax equity finance, then the owner is not SEVCA, and a smaller amount of the value of each kilowatt hour is actually going to the low-income families.
I think, isn't it like, is it 7 years that we take over ownership?
Yeah, it depends on the exact transaction,
It's
but
different.
potentially. And, if it were 7 years, then maybe that would be a viable solution. But we really hope that SEVCA can be the owner immediately, and we really hope that the low-income clientele of SEVCA can have the full benefit of each and every kilowatt hour.
I would say we still haven't ruled that out as one of the options for this model on a broader scale, but we still wanted to try to do it without that at this point. And I thought we also then, at one point said, because we raised a certain amount of money and we didn't need as much, we weren't gonna put the whole project cost up to tax equity investment, that it was no longer large enough to interest a lot of the investors who might have been interested.
That's another
I remember some discussion about that. 1 second, there was a question up here and then.
I was just gonna ask, what reason does Green Mountain Power have for in your lawn,
Say that again?
Well, why does Green Mountain Power, did they give a reason for saying that they will not allow you to change?
Oh, no, before?
Just it's administratively complex, because you have, besides just you, there's hundreds,
all the
thousands of
others
others
that
who
are
do the
doing
same
this,
thing.
right.
I was just saying that, though in that situation, if there are people who have excess solar, they could, like someone had said before, you gift it necessarily if they wanted to SEVCA. Then SEVCA could then redistribute those credits to all the other viable, because you're not gonna use up all that credit
Right.
yourself.
No, we wouldn't.
And that would, as long as you do it just no more than 4 times a year, that would work. So we could have hundreds of people gifting you excess solar, and you would have thousands of kilowatt hours to dispose of. It's just an accounting measure from Green Mountain Power. But if there are people who have excess solar they're not using, they could then, so that might be a plea that SEVCA could make.
I don't think that works. I tried doing that,
You did.
and what you have to do is you sign an agreement where basically you accept responsibility for their bill, they accept responsibility for you. It's more of a marriage than you want. And the alternative would be to set a fixed amount of your electric generation per month
Yes.
that goes there. And that's gonna vary from year to year, so it could leave you in the red.
Right. So, are you keeping track of who's raised their hand, by the way? I'm sorry, I can't remember who had their hands up next. I think you were one of the.
I already went to it, so someone else will like to.
Oh, is there someone else that hasn't spoken yet?
Okay.
Right.
How many
Oh.
projects of this kind are there in the state?
In Vermont,
Yeah.
there's none like this. There is one other that's utility sponsored up in
Middlebury,
Middlebury. I thought it was,
there's a rooftop thing in
maybe
GMP's
it was. I
building
thought
in
there was
Middlebury.
There's a South Railton project through VLS that occurred a few years ago. That's a tricky one
I
though.
think there was one that was just, it was at a transfer station that it was, the array was built. Did that ring a bell to anybody?
How is Washington's done?
What's that?
I know Washington has some kind of a community.
Yeah, there's
Yeah.
several
I don't
community
know
solar
what that is.
projects. I founded one in Randolph, and there's several others. There's one in Rutland, there's one in the Medford Valley, which may be the one you're referring to, that Aegis Solar did. These were grassroots solar. They're not done anymore because
Right.
the Public Utility Commission closed the door on that in
Yeah.
2017.
And this is really trying to get to low-income off-takers, whereas the other community solar.
In other words, right,
That
first
has
come,
been
first served
specifically a
subscribers,
focus.
right. Yeah,
Yeah, I might have missed this. I think you said the cost was around $293,000,
that's our
And
best
the-
last estimate, yeah.
and FEA cannot contribute to construction?
The LIHEAP program can, except for the carve-outs that they might be like weatherization. But they use all that weatherization carve-out now in Vermont, so we'd have to switch around how the weatherization program is being funded.
So FEA is not benefiting this program at all?
Not at this time, no.
Okay.
Not at this time, yes.
Does the second phase require another CPG, and can you separately meter that, that around?
Meters separately, is that what you're at?
Yeah, can you separately meter that? Is that the plan?
It's the same certificate.
It's the same.
Oh, I don't,
Okay.
I don't know that,
There's one CPG.
For both?
the whole thing, so it's gonna function as one, once it's finished, as one single
Yes, sir.
project, okay.
So is your point, if it's two, maybe you have 2 meters, you then can have eight.
Yeah.
Eight change a meter. Panel gets.
Well, we'll look into some of your suggestions, yeah.
So has the federal program agreed to use the heating assistance dollars to, if you get this organized and connected to the recipients, proper recipients, have they agreed to funnel the funds through them, or I guess?
No, not at this point,
the
that's why
capital-
they couldn't, that's what they were trying to get them to agree to, the feds, and the feds said, we can't deal with this, essentially. Their response was, what we heard from the state folks at DCF was quite positive, but they felt like their hands were tied, or they just didn't feel like they had the knowledge to kind of push it through the bureaucracy as it exists now. That may change with a different administration, but, which we would hope, but, so this is gonna be a separate, somewhat parallel, level of assistance, and that's it would be easier if they said, yeah, we'll do it for this population, for this amount, and then we could have just said, okay, we know all the criteria, we know what all the parameters of eligibility would be, but now they've said, no, you're on your own, and so we're trying to now, do it in a way which we think is the most beneficial use of the funds, of the electricity that's generated, and as always, sometimes you give it too many choices, and it makes it challenging to figure out what the best one is. That's
Can I
what
just
we're.
add one thing to that,
Yeah.
Steve? At this point in time, we're not able to do as you describe and use those dollars, but we're hoping that this will lead to the ability to do so.
Yeah.
The energy assistance
Demonstrating the
community, not the service providers are very innovative, but the federal program is very calcified. There's no culture of innovation
Yeah.
in that federal service. And so we're hoping that we can generate a chorus around this idea, because from our perspective, this is not a Republican idea or a Democratic idea, it's just a good idea, right? And so we're hoping that political will grow for this model.
Yeah, potentially it's actually a very conservative idea in that it allows, third-party providers to provide innovative, testing ground laboratories for new kinds of ways of doing this, as you've been trying to create a model for. And so I think a lot of conservative Republicans would be in favor of it as well.
We've got time for probably 2 more
Oh,
questions,
sure.
and then we're
Okay.
getting up to the
All right,
next
well,
session.
we'll hear and-
And then there's back there.
So
his head
this
down
is
for-
just a half-baked idea, but I would imagine for a lot of folks, one of the big issues is the cash flow, that you have very uneven energy expenditures, and that it's all bunched up and at its peak in January and February. And did you look at something where households, subscribers would still pay the market rate for their heat, electric heat presumably, either a heat pump or electric resistance, but that you would assist them in leveling the cost to a 12-month fixed rate average, so that at least you take away the
spike.
You take away the spike, but you don't subsidize their expenditures in any other way. Did that come up as a?
We have not, I have not heard that suggested, although it's an interesting thought.
That's
I
actually
mean,
done automatically through the net metering program. So you have a 12-month window to use those credits. So the seasonality of the
They just
of the
wouldn't.
But there are
power
two ways.
generation doesn't affect the.
But if you're an off-taker, there are two ways to, you know, pay for your discounted credits typically. One is based on actual array performance, and the other is a 12-month level. So I'm just
Mhm.
wondering if that was something that they looked at.
We have not as yet looked at that, but we certainly will see if that's a model worth looking at. This fellow over here has been trying to get it working.
Is this approach limited nationally to states that enable power purchasing agreements? And if so, does that place limitations on what the federal government might be willing to do if it could only operate in certain states?
That's a good question. So this project doesn't have a power purchase agreement. But, you know, kind of related to your question is, does this model only apply where there's enabling legislation for virtual net metering credits or community solar? And we've created a model that works in both. So for example, in Minnesota, we have 176 utilities, electric utilities. And each and every utility has its own rules and regs regarding interconnections and virtual net metering credits, et cetera. And so we've also created a model where you can basically do something that Paige described, where you can bank credits and give those to the Community Action Agency, which can then give them to their low-income clients. So we're trying to create models that work regardless of the regulatory ecosystem. So there's the risk of that being the case, but we're trying to make it work regardless of that, if that makes sense.
Yeah.
So we have run out of time. I wanted to thank our two speakers so much for a really interesting, informative, creative, innovative idea. So excited you guys are out there doing this work, and you know, clearly it flags some ideas of, you know, maybe policy changes that need to be made to be able to support this kind of model that can be done at the state and things that can be done at the federal level. So it's really exciting to try these out and see what comes up as barriers, like the, you know, 4 changes seems ridiculous. And if maybe there's a state policy we could change to you know, take away some of those unnecessary seeming barriers if possible. But the next session is in the terrace ballroom with a really great keynote speaker, so please get over there. I bet the two speakers can hang out for a minute or two, although I know Joey would very much appreciate everyone being there on time for the next session. Thank you all again, and thank you to our speakers.